Okay, folks, we move on with the next presentation here at the DNA Workshop, sponsored by Family Tree DNA and supported by volunteers like myself and Brian from ISOG, the International Society of Genetic Genealogy. So do join the society. It's completely free to join, and it will give you a lot of support and advice with your DNA results. Now, there is a bag down here that somebody has left behind. So if you've left your bag here, please do come and collect it, and make sure you take your bag with you when you're leaving, because you may never see it again otherwise. So on to the talk, and Brian has been involved with family history since 1967. He's a founder member of the Norfolk, West Surrey and Difford Family History Society, as well as a member of the Society of Genealogists and the Guild of One-Name Studies. And he began involvement with DNA testing for family history purposes in 2000, and more seriously from early 2006. So he is a well-seasoned expert in DNA. But today he's going to talk about the study of emigrants from Britain and how this can, how the study of the emigrants from Britain can help both the emigrants' descendants and the British left behind in tracing their own family lines back by using DNA for triangulation, and especially before 1800. So please give a big warm welcome to Brian Swann.
Hi, welcome. This is really my experience in family history going back a long time. And I was going to start just by showing you this. This is the very first book I bought on family history, 1966, a whole 80 pages. Table of contents, and in those days we covered Scottish and Irish ancestry and Englishmen abroad in the whole 5 pages. Game has reached a stage now where we actually write books on the history of genealogy, and that is actually quite interesting because, you know, we've been going a long time and people tend to forget that. This is this ancestry business, cash registers flickering at, you know, who do you think you are, just like we are today, etc. BBC Celebrities Genealogy Series, who do you think you are, very highly thought of. I am going to go quite fast today, I'm going to say that. And if you want to go back and relook at it afterwards, that's fine. One of the persons who introduced me, forgotten now, is a guy called Don Steele, one of the leading lights, and that particular book, Family Matters, shows how he's one of the leading lights in founding all this organisation. The other book that influenced me, still in print, is called The World We Have Lost. And sometimes I feel that a little bit with the family history societies that are around here, given the tsunami of DNA data that seems to be overrolling in them, and from people abroad. But again, still worth looking at, The World We Have Lost. I've got the titles in there you can come back and look at. Very interesting titles like Did the Peasants Really Starve? Always appeals to me. Personal Discipline and Social Survival. But again, it's a very good overview of British history before we all started, you know, migrating around in significant quantities. Still valid today. Okay, if you do any DNA testing, you're bound to come across Americans in your project. And essentially what I'm trying to say is collaborations with Americans, Commonwealth countries and emigration can have advantages. Initially, triangulation matches. It can be easier to recruit people abroad than it can be for people in this country when you come to tracing your family history. Collaboration and money. Hopefully you know more about the history and research techniques over here and documentation, and can access non-indexed material, not online, more easily. Plus knowledge of local geography, topography, record offices, etc. Play your cards right. I've been generally lucky on the projects and Americans I've been involved with, but to some extent you make your own luck. So personal journey, working with researchers abroad. Every country has its own narrative. Particularly for America, free settlers, religious settlers, head rights, indentured servants, convicts, slaves, represented degradation in freedom of their choice of migration. For Virginia, Maryland, the southern states, the West Indies, it was driven principally by tobacco, rice, sugar, and lately by cotton and sometimes iron, etc., as the continent grows. And on a global basis, the involvement in Britain in all this is still being recognised in research. You know, there's children's homes emigration down to Australia, which is and Canada, which is a bit topical at the moment. And the thing we tend to forget, Asian emigration, when the British essentially stopped, is still ongoing. And I'm just going to show this graph taken from a very recent paper by a lady called Claire Anderson. We started transporting convicts from New South Wales at 1787-8, finished to Australia in 1869, but essentially other convicts that were non-European got transported down the British Isles. In fact, to quite recently, this is down as far as 1939. So immigration continues even if we finish with it in Britain. Wonderful book on the this is just my take. My experience is Americans commonly try and trace all family lines in all directions back to the vessels that brought them to America. They've got a 400-year cut-off in there. Before then, of course, they have to trace family history across several countries in Europe, which us who remain behind don't necessarily have to do. Certainly helps the British to interact if you've got some idea of European history, especially before First World War. And I would argue some idea of American history, both before and after 1776 to 1783, which I hope most of you know is the American Revolution or the Revolutionary War. No one was in the Americas before 1606-7, all native tribes. Apologies to the French, Canadians and Spanish whenever I say that. There's always people that remind me that's that. But I've got to approximate somehow in this conversation. And if I was an American, I'd probably do this as well. But we can have 750 plus years of paper to research, and so it's a balance really between the two. We can also face migration questions, but often going back to the 1600s or earlier, Huguenot refugees, Jewish immigration. There's always an ongoing discussion about Anglo-Norman migration when we own bits of Normandy. We only lost Boulogne in 1553, Calais in 1558, owned big chunks of France before that. And of course we go there regularly. This is a quick flick through some documents. These are monuments that Americans don't necessarily see where they come to England. This is a monument to the first settlers of Virginia. The blurb is on the right. I just want you to really concentrate on the picture. It's in Docklands, which is down here, so it tends not to be on the main tourist route, so Americans don't go and look at it. There it is. You can see it in relation to the dome that you will know. We were into early activities in relation to shipping and emigration. This is an item called the Howland Great Wet Dock, which is at Deptford from 1703. It was the first big dock that allows ships in there to anchor. So again, that was pioneering in its whole time with London Docklands. Tobacco is very important, so we even have a tobacco dock to these days down in Stepney. Tobacco warehouses, this is 1800 or so, but again, remains of all of that colonial history in transporting activities over to Virginia, Maryland, those sorts of areas, because that was the first thing that really made significant amounts of money. Oops. Just to mention the Museum of London Docklands, which is there. Again, highly recommended. It's exactly what it says on the can, Museum of London Docklands, all to do with shipping, emigration, sort of things I'm touching on today. There it is from the outside. This is family history as it used to be done. This is the Society of Genealogists when it was a gentleman's club. And the only point of me showing this is when I joined it, I had a letter from a gentleman saying I was the first person to join in 20 years with my surname, which was Swan. But in particular, he gave me 3 hand-drawn pedigrees from Swan families in Kent, 2 of which claimed to have coat of arms, and the third one came from a place called Shipbourne in Kent, which is in the middle. And ultimately, that's proved useful in a story which I hope to get to today. I was taught my way around London by a gentleman called Cliff Webb before Ancestry had digitised a whole bunch of stuff. Learned it from the West Surrey publications. This is Cliff Webb, genealogist. Not to be confused if I type them into Google with Harry Webb, who's this gentleman here on the right. And Cliff said, any genealogical study needs careful planning and this sort of stuff. It is perplexing that many people accept that most skills and subjects cannot be learned without substantial study of written materials, expect to be able to conduct genealogical research without reading a text on the subject. And I do still get concerned about that in spite of all of our automation of stuff that's around. And talking about London, 1/6 of the population of England and Wales live in London. High proportion of the population has always lived in London. It's always been a centre of migration going back in history. So Most genealogists have to tackle London ancestry sooner or later, and many, one suspects, give up and seek easier lines at that stage, although Ancestry has done an awful lot to change that recently. Much of London genealogy in reality consists of trying to get out of London as fast as you can, ideally to a nice parish with a nice set of parish registers. My local society still sells items which are useful to people in London, City of London examinations, association oath rolls with costs situated there. And again, if you ever look at maps of Middlesex and London in terms of the jurisdictions, they are very complicated. This is Middlesex, and this is London, which I call a kaleidoscope of colours in terms of who had jurisdiction over what. Now, in theory, that doesn't help you too much when you just search for surnames on Ancestry, but when you get into some other records, you do need to have some idea of who controlled what in terms of where records survive. You can find that online at Ancestry if you know where to go and look. Very quick, again, bit of history. There was a search by a gentleman for a Mr. Thomas Kirby, who went to Virginia. This took 30 years to solve using conventional paper. The bottom line is, when they found him, James Kirby was so pleased that he actually gave Kirby Hall, which is the current house of the Norfolk Genealogy Society, as a result of having traced his ancestor back across the pond. So that took about 30 years to do, and as far as I know, it was one of the first ones there. That just describes his obituary, which you don't have to read particularly. And he lived in Claremont. That's Claremont Manor in Virginia. This is Claremont Manor down over here. I've got a Swan Bay sitting there, and we'll come back to this map in a moment. These are the acreages of plantations in Virginia. This is the James River, which runs through Virginia. And basically what I'm trying to talk about is this pioneer project today, which is, in the history of ISOG wikis, this is a 2000 surname project trying to trace two families with a William Swan of Swann's Point in Virginia and an Edward Swan of Maryland. That was the state of art of DNA testing in 2000. That's a whole 5 markers down here on the Y chromosome. And this is the project I look after, a Swan DNA project, fairly, well, reasonable size as surname projects go. We've got about 116 sitting in there. It comes to me. Thing is, that initial DNA article got written up. The lady who did it claimed that they had a match. And of course, because it's online, even now, people come back and ask me about it because it's online. If it's online, of course, it's published, and, you know, that's the way that it is. She got very excited at the time, and of course, when it fell away, when further testing came on, to some extent, that's when I lost interest in DNA. And I picked it up again in about 2006. She was trying to find the match between these two people. I get a credit in it that I was trying to sort of sort out the lines, which is the bit at the bottom. And to some extent, I've let that go and have come back on it in more recent years. Those are the people who get credit for it. That's just what's happened to them. One of them has died. One of them is actually still going strong, age 89, would desperately like to know where he comes from. Of course, the lady I collaborated with has also died, and basically this is their story. The thing is, there's a tombstone, as we'll see, over in Virginia, which has a nice coat of arms on it. And these are the Swan families that have been knighted, have coats of arms, and essentially people try and match it to the families that have the coat of arms for obvious reasons. I was helped very much by the person I said at the beginning, who had done trees back in those days of families that actually had the coat of arms and one other family. So I did know that as a starter. The other Swan, who's an Edward Swan in Maryland, has a chapter in a book written about him in 2001, which is a very useful start point. And the William Swan lived here at Swan's Point, which is across the road from James City. That's the plantation, etc., that he had on the James River. And as I say, there's only one person really, or one family sort of younger than this, or initially. He took this plantation over, as you see, in 1635. The person who was there before was John Rolfe, and he, of course, married Pocahontas, as anyone in America knows. That's the statue of Pocahontas in Gravesend, which is actually beefed up now as a monument. So I was really quite pleased when you find all of this out as to where people come from. This is a very nice map of London in 1662, principally to show Stepney here. All the early boats that sailed to America, particularly Virginia, Maryland, etc., left from Stepney. They did not leave from up here in the town. They transshipped stuff at Stepney. In those days, Stepney straggled along the river. There were other parishes coming in here. That's the Tower of London. I think I got that blown up there a bit. That's St Paul's Cathedral, Stepney, Ratcliffe, Limehouse, Redriff. I have the names there. Royal Dockyard down here. Nice picture of what London looked at that time. This is London Bridge, and this is Gravesend. That's Pocahontas again. Gravesend is actually very important when it comes to shipping. But in the words of Michael Caine, not so many people know that. And the reason why is at the bottom here. Gravesend is the final registration departure point for emigrants leaving London. So they basically took people into Gravesend, got them to swear loyalty to the king, etc. before they went. And when the ships came in, they put the customs people on the boats at Gravesend to have a day to crawl all over the boats to sort everything before the boat docked back in London. That's how customs worked in those days. So Gravesend was really very important. Nice picture of Gravesend. And this is really what I say here. Gravesend is the outer limit of the Port of London. Customs men or searchers boarded the ships. They sorted through. Many smugglers, whatever. But of course, the important thing was the revenue from all of this to the government. That's what it was all about. This is the Custom House in London, close to the Tower. There's a parish next door called All Hallows Barking. Worth mentioning that those parish registers are not online. So just in case you all think that every parish register in London is online, as far as I'm aware, those are not online. And tracing people to America would be very easy apart from this one event. This is the Custom House in 1755. And in 12th of February 1814, there was a disaster. The Custom House, as you can see here, went up in flames. And without that, of course, tracing emigrant ancestors would be one hell of a lot easier. Most people, if you're doing American family history, remember the archive fire in Virginia. We can also burn things to the ground with just equal effect. Basically, people thought there was gunpowder in the basement, and so they just let the fire burn. I'm just going to leave that there. You can watch it on the video, but that describes the Custom House fire and what's behind it, really. But the key message was there was gunpowder in the basement, and they just let the fire burn. There's contemporary talk of manuscripts blowing out into Hackney Marshes about 4 miles away. That's London Customs House where it is today. This, I think, is the anchor chain of HMS Belfast. Most people here will know the Gherkin. And this is the picture that very few Americans ever take because they don't appreciate its significance in terms of immigration and everything else. They recognise all the rest, Tower Bridges down here, etc. This is to show what happens with some records in America. This is the evacuation of Richmond. That's what happens to a huge chunk of the archives in Virginia. They were burnt to the ground in the Civil War period. So it's quite rare for me to get queries that come in from New England, places like that. The queries you get are from people from Virginia, whatever, Maryland, where the records have been lost. I'm just going to leave these up here. You can go back and have a look at them. That's a book on the customs and exercise. Those are the chapters involving all the sort of things that are involved in that. I've got a few things like that you just have to look at your leisure. So I'm trying to cover really quite a lot of ground, obviously quite quickly. That's the surname atlas. I only mention that because Swan, 10,000 entries. I'm not going to run a one-name study on this. I'm really dependent on people as they come in. Just some idea of where it's distributed as a consequence of that. I hope most of you have some idea what the surname atlas is. If not, there's on the Gilder One Name Studies. It's not online at Ancestry. I hasten to mention. Very useful way to map to counties. Just other examples. Of course, we get Swan queries in from Ireland. I'm very lucky I have a lady who covers Ireland. This is taken from a particular gentleman, Irish origins, Swan distribution from there. And you can see concentrates in Northern Ireland and so on. The one thing for sure about Swan is it's not an Irish surname, so it's come from somewhere. My very brief bit of DNA, STRs measure, I regard it the leaves on the trees, SNPs measure the branches, etc. in terms of this. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Other people have talked about that a lot in other presentations here. Quick talk about indentured servants. Indentured servants were people that were picked up by farmers commonly in the 17th century from London. They were shipped out for a contract. The period of time varied, but it was often 4 years, could be as long as 6. And one of the recent works on this suggests that the principal contributions to indentured servants going is they were fatherless, no inheritance, friendless, so they had no social contact to obtain work, and or released from prison. I'm not saying that that's for everybody, but it gives you some idea of the status of the sort of people that went as indentured servants. And they went to Virginia, Maryland, and then to some extent to the Carolinas. There's a talk there about redemptioners that are people sometimes transported as German colonists also to that part of the world. This is really the only map that I'm aware of in relating to where indentured servants came from. This is a work of Nathan Murphy here, where he's analysed the records that survive from Bristol as to where these people came from. And as you can see, there's a very tight clustering around, relatively tight clustering around Bristol itself. But it does reach out, you know, with odd bits to all parts of the country. Even with Bristol, there's a clustering around London. And London, it's really very difficult to look at that sort of data. There's been a very recent book on indentured migration, which I'm just putting up here. It's the best book that I'm aware of looking at indentured migration, covering that sort of time period. It's just to show, as always, that there are people that spend their lives looking at this particular thing that I'm trying to convey to you in terms of emigration. That's an overview of what the book's about, but it's essentially, there's great want of servants provides the first detailed examination of the English trade in indentured servants, looking at that particular time period. And you're transporting people long distances for this. So the transportation system was not benign, neither in the sugar plantations of the West Indies or in the tobacco plantations. It was hard work for all the people that were transported. This is slightly later for London. There's records that survive from Middlesex sessions for people that were potentially involved in kidnapping, and it gives you some idea of the parishes that were involved in this kidnapping. Again, Stepney that we've seen. This is the south part of London, and so on. So there was forcible means used on occasions to get people onto boats. And where did they go? Again, the pie charts just show that, you know, Maryland, Virginia, Carolinas. They're records that survive for this particular period for London. And again, huge numbers to the West Indies and so on, based on 2,100 people. And there's really the only good records that survive for the 17th century as to where people went. Just to remind you, this is where we are. We got in here in 2009. This is the expanded DNA area. That's a bit of my history. ISOG, we've talked about the ISOG stand, the ISOG wiki, testing comparison charts, test before you buy, etc. A number of members on Facebook. I just wanted to put this quote up because, you know, naval activity is really important to Britain. Strategic considerations. And this is a quote from 1757, which you can read, but the bottom line is, if France should ever rival England in naval power and breaking considerably our North American colonies, it will then, of course, distress, if not destroy, our commercial interests and finally reduce Britain to a state of dependence on France, if not become a province of that country. Surely then all possible means should be used and extended on our part to have very powerful fleets stationed at sea. And so naval history is an absolutely integral part of British family history. I don't think it's quite as strong in America as it is over here, but it's so much part of our trading history, both in the Royal Navy, whatever. And without the Royal Navy, really, we went from a position where we were pretty poorly off in the late 1660s, time of Samuel Pepys, to the predominance in the 1700s. And it's basically to protect our trade which drove all of that, because we were an island nation. I'm going to run through that very quickly. That's the population of America. It just shows how fast it expands. If you look down the left-hand column here, to the time of the Revolution, you're up to about 2 million people that have gone to America. A lot of them have died, of course, in between that time, but some idea of how the population's increased. That just talks about the background. If you want one-stop shopping on the history of naval maritime Britain, I would recommend this book because it covers everything in it: men, money, strategy, operations, administration, logistics, whatever. It is important to understand something about the maritime history of Britain and why it's important. That's just a guide as well that goes with it. The best book on the Royal Navy in Europe during the period of the American Revolutionary War was actually written by an American. Again, people tend to forget what's happening in Britain during that period. Everyone tends, quite often, our American colleagues focus on what's happening in America and becoming independent. But we were faced with some very considerable problems over here in Britain, like with the French appearing outside Plymouth in 1778, which you can imagine caused quite a panic at the time. Convicts were always transported. I do have to mention Peter Coldham, who published a phenomenal amount of work relating to transportation in that sort of area. Quite a lot of his material is now on Ancestry. We went on after we finished sending convicts to America. We worked around for about 13 years to try and find a good home for them. Covered very well in this book called A Merciless Place, Story of Britain's Lost Convict Disaster in Africa. And of course, eventually we settled in Australia, New South Wales, and that's another story, different period of time. Let me just spend a bit of time talking through the National Archives website. This may be very familiar to some of you, but may not be familiar to others. Absolutely key to researching records in Britain now. Help with your research. Search 1,000 years of records. Research guides. Does anyone not looked at research guides on the National Archives website? You've all been there and looked at it? Okay. Just bear in mind this talk gets videoed and goes outside, so I did think it would be worth just talking that through. There are really valuable work records in there in relation to shipping. These are merchant seafarers, but all sorts of other things that are in there. Records of the boards of customs, excise, these sort of things. Merchant trade records, port books which survive there. Licenses to pass beyond the seas, most of which has been digitized, but that again is searchable on the Discovery website. Emigrants to the American colonies, which again has been put into book form, but you can also search that on the archives at the National Archives. There are lists there about records of ships, merchant passengers going to the American colonies, recorded in the port books, again, available at the National Archives there. I don't think all of those are necessarily online. That's the key form really for where you're doing an advanced search. Putting words in here, typing in references here, and essentially searching all the National Archives or one of the other websites, because this becomes the passport really to look across the whole of Britain now, not just records that are here in London. So very quickly, some of the people I've worked on. This is the history of a Richard Swann, who's in Rowley in Massachusetts. He's been well researched, emigrated to New England in between 1634 and 1635. Early book mentioned to him. They've even got maps showing where he had an estate in Rowley in Massachusetts. Rowley in Massachusetts is named after this place in Yorkshire. And again, it's one of these people where the priest, the minister at the time decided to emigrate, and he took his people with him, and other people followed with him. And the actual church at Rowley has a ship put in the stained glass there to commemorate that. And that's not a terribly good thing because it's scraped off the thing. But if any of you remember Jodie Kidd when she did Who Do You Think You Are? She actually was filmed going into the church there, and that was part of her story. You know, looking at the church window and so on. So in general, I get very, very few people coming from that family. It's very well documented. I think I've got 2 people in there from those DNA projects that I run. And that really says it. You know, rare to get members. They stuck, want to connect in. So far, no one has tried to recruit anyone other than their immediate family, and no one has ever tried to research the family back further, as far as I know. Various books talk about voyages to the west. This is a book by Bernard Balin. Describes really what is in the book, and some other good books that I've got in there covering aspects of shipping. One thing I wanted to show from Bernard Balin's book were the routes really out of here when people landed in Virginia. There were routes that were used to take convicts, indentured servants, off the boats and take them round these sole drivers in the back country to sort of get the people parceled out to people over there. It's quite difficult to trace that sort of thing, but that's part of what has been said. There are records that survive for this particular series of years up here, 1773 to 1776, covering England, Scotland, and others. The point really is to make that London, even then, was still a very predominant port for where people left from. So you do have to get involved in the history of London. There are other ports covered in smaller details as the emigrant trade broadened from there. That's the same figures for Scotland in there, Greenock, and small numbers from other things. But again, Greenock tends to be the overwhelming port there for Scotland. Going in family group versus alone, again, London for people travelling alone, very, very significant. The next largest place was Yorkshire. And again, the numbers here show again that London is a very significant, well, the major player in all of this game. So even though the other ports are a lot there documented, London was still the predominant port. And these are there are relatively few records you can get at any of this data, but that's one of the classes of data that you can. Scotland is a bit different. Those are some of the figures for Scotland at the same time period. And the Hebrides is the highest one there. And these are some idea of the numbers that went from the ports across Scotland. Again, numbers just showing where the population went over to America. I'm going to skip that one. It's really the expansion of the southern colonies in America, heading westwards, which is basically how America was colonized. They went into the East Coast ports first, and then fanned out from there into Kentucky, places like that, South Georgia, heading west. I am going to mention briefly other records that survive at Kew, which have not been indexed These are Royal Navy pay list ships muster rolls, a huge slew of lists that are there. Masses and masses of people in these volumes which had not been indexed because the Royal Navy was so important in terms of the number of people that served there. They have seamen from all over Britain in terms of the people that went there. Later on, you get to crew lists, which date from 1835. You get nice pictures on the crew list of vessels that are involved in shipping people around. This is later. It's class BT 98. They coincide with the 1841-1851 census. Again, 448 boxes. Again, they at the moment have not been imaged, not been put online. Very important, really, in relation to shipping. When ships go wrong, when things go wrong, they end up in Britain in the High Court of Admiralty, which had jurisdiction over shipping. That again is an important series of documents over here, which has barely been touched, really, the High Court of Admiralty. Because so few stuff remain relating to shipping, that's an important class. And they cover basically criminal activity that happened through Britain. Just some idea of the classes that are sitting there at the High Court of Admiralty. And this prize series of papers is actually being worked on as I speak to you. So a complete guide to the records involving shipping. Those prize papers are going online on this particular catalogue that's called Brill. That again is not part of the normal data packages that you get into. So there are records that are being digitized at the National Archives, but they go into other subscription packages than the main ones that you have. And there's an appreciable number of names in there. These are prize papers which relate to captured ships during the American Revolutionary War, that sort of period that's going on. That's the Brill. That's a corresponding project that's happening in relation to Dutch records, because they cover a lot of nationalities where papers are captured. So I said I'm going to go through those quite quickly. Find My Past now, again, has early emigration from Britain, covering these sort of dates as well as ancestry. Some of them are complementary, some of them are separate. So you do really need to look at both of them. There's one outlier here, which is a record that's turned up at the Gravesend Register of passengers passing through that place. It just, again, gives some idea of what's been lost, I think, in terms of our shipping records, that would be really valuable. There's a study being made of those looking at Ireland and the war at sea between these dates, which again just starts to give some idea of what survives in there in relation to naval history and Ireland. It's hard work to dig that out. I know we tend to be interested in surnames names when we look at this, but it's also a very important part of the naval history of what's going on. When I've had to learn this, two books I found useful, really, particularly relating to Maryland, are English and Catholic, which is discussed the Lords Baltimore, who ran most of Maryland at that period in time. They were Catholic. Most of Virginia was Protestant, and there was a tension going on for a long period of time, really, from the foundation of Virginia to the foundation of Maryland, particularly to a period of time around here, 1646, where Maryland was plundered, the population went down very low, and then it was repopulated, but it wasn't repopulated at that stage by Catholics, it was other people that came in. This is a document relating to the first appointment of a customs officer in Virginia, dating back to 1636-7. That's basically what it says. why the gentleman was appointed. I found this book useful when I was looking at shipping records that were there. That's London's political change, political conflict, London's overseas traders. It's important to remember that we weren't just dealing with Virginia, Maryland, we were dealing with the rest of the world. And that is quite easily forgotten, that we were dealing with the rest of the world. The Swan family I mentioned at Swan's Point occurs in this particular book, which is the book, if you like, relating to early people going to America. These people down here are related, and if you can claim ancestry from them, you can get yourselves induced in the Jamestown Society. And this is the Swan family at Swan's Point. It's supposed to be the coat of arms. This is a book that goes back to 1956, all looking very impressive. That's a tombstone. You can just about make out the swan here with the coats of arms still sitting there in Swan's Point. This is a sign saying it's there. Got the wrong name on the sign, I'd hasten to add. This is William Swan's tomb, dated 1680. It's actually Thomas Swan. This William Swan went over with 24 headrights. Headrights were people that were used basically to claim land in Virginia. They were essentially used as currencies. So the fact that he registered those headrights to claim the land bears no relationship to when they actually were shipped. They were literally used as currency. So you always need to be careful that the names mentioned in here are not necessarily the dates when they were transported at all. They were moved around. And there are names in here that were clearly family names if you reconstruct the trees of the gentleman that emigrated. So some of these people were his family, other people were people that were traded from London. And what caused a lot of confusion was that there's an article in the Virginia magazine. It goes back to 1919, where this reprint appears talking about this family in Virginia and comparing it with other families that are mentioned before with Swans, and are mentioned here in Bury's Kent. And again, most people totally ignore what Bury's Kent is. But it's in fact the first decent first decent history book that came out on the history of Kent, with family trees and charts and so on in it. And what he's really saying is that these families here do not seem to appear in Bury's Kent. So the family in Swan's Point do not appear in Bury's Kent. And all of this article through here, which I don't expect you to read at all, but it actually relates to a document that was written down by the grandson of the person who emigrated to America in that headright claim that we looked at. So he did what we'd all love to have done. Somebody actually wrote down in 1707 where they come from. And in there he actually says, you know, I died in, see if I can find it. This one here, my grandfather William Swan married again the first day of May 1637 and died the last day of February in the 52nd year of his age and was buried at Swan's Point. Isn't that lovely? It really actually tells you when he was born. The only thing is, I'm going to skip that. That's actually trying to sort out some of the other person in there to try and find where the tree was today. And the answer is I can't find it today. This is Bury's Kent, which has a nice Swan family history in here coming down. For people here, there's an Edward Swan sitting down here at the bottom. If you remember originally, we were trying to connect a William Swan and an Edward Swan back there. And so people have taken this. They've assumed this Edward Swan here, of course, was the gentleman who was over in Maryland and made them fit. That's just the visitation pedigrees of Swan, coats of arms. That's down in Y. Y Church. But when you blow that up, these Edward Swans down here, both buried. So these are impossibly the Edward Swan who turns up in Maryland. They also say that this could be the William Swan who's in that pedigree. The only thing is, if you look across the records here, there's not an actual date for him, but the other ones are baptized in 1611, 1614, and so on. So there's no way he can be someone who died in 1638 in his 51st year. And of course, there are masses and masses and masses of pedigrees confusing all of this and not being able to sort it out. So you get lists of children. This is just an example, sitting here with various swans down here, which just get cobbled together. Even with arrival years in 1638, when we've seen that he claimed head rights in 1635, so he certainly had to be there to register the head rights. Whole bunch of different surnames, different wives and husbands sitting there. If you look at the names, some knighted. And at the bottom line, we've managed to trace all the swans from this descendant down to this gentleman here, down 3 different branches, the 3 different people, take DNA tests from them, and that gives us our one signature. So although this is the gentleman who emigrated, everyone that lives at the moment in America with this gentleman of Swan's Point descension, this gentleman here, Thompson Swan, there may possibly be one generation back, borderline, but almost everyone else comes from here. That's the claim to get into the Jamestown Society, and so everybody really has to come from this person here, because that's ultimately where you triangulate on to do those matches. So you've got a very good genetic signature now of these 3 people. So we can say for sure, if you come from this gentleman owned at Swan's Point, this is your genetic signature. And this gentleman down here was over the moon. He managed to get himself into the Jamestown Society, which is pretty prestigious in America. And that's really what that says there. It was really helped by one particular document. There's a series of things called Virginia Chancery Proceedings, which are also online, fairly recent. This particular lady died in 1800. The court ordered, she made a will that was contested, and they decided to divide it between her 4 sons and her 4 brothers and 1 sister. There's a lovely description here, which I have to take time to read, but it says basically, there was a lot of confusion between all the people we asked to find out the ancestry of this person and got many conflicting information. This is dated 1857, so this started in 1800, this is still going in 1857, and the case papers finally got deposited in 1869. So there's 364 pages there. I've yet to see anyone transcribe it, but it's just an absolute mass of detail to sort all of that out. I picked through some of it, and if you ever want a Rosetta Stone to help sort out a family, that's the one. The point about talking about, I'm going to do this orally because we're going to run short of time, I think, otherwise. If you go and look for swans in Gravesend, there was a marriage between the William Swan who emigrated and a Judith Austin in Stepney in 1612. So everyone assumes he must be baptized in Gravesend. You go and look in the Gravesend parish registers, and of course he's not there. If you go to the next parish, though, which is Milton next Gravesend, it doesn't actually say that there, but that's Milton next Gravesend. That was actually where they had the customs place, where they put the people on board, and there is a Swan family there. And if you think right back to the bit that I started with, that when I joined the Society of Genealogists, the guy who sent me 3 pedigrees that he worked on, one of them was that family from Shipbourne, and there's a William Swan in there who fits exactly the person who ends up in Virginia. And there's a Nicholas Swan, which is not that common a surname, sitting in Milton next Gravesend. And so although you never get proof for these things, that's as good as I think you're going to get, that this family managed to get from Shipbourne to Milton, and so they'd have said he was from Gravesend, and when he went up to London. to Stepney, which is where he was married. I'd love another record between then and 1635 when he arrived in Virginia, but that's not happening. I'm going to skip those. Those are just to show where the places are: Southfleet and Northfleet, Shipbourne, and this Lidwye family. These are the two families basically with the coat of arms. And I said, you do their family trees, and it doesn't fit the person with the date that's there. Stepney Parish Register is very detailed. This is the William Swan of Gravesend getting married. They have wonderful descriptions in Stepney. Some of them are really plain, bold descriptions and don't say very much. You've got to be aware of things like this, where a John Swan stated to be the second Swan of a Thomas Swan down here. This is from Berks Landed Gentry, 1879. Things that go back that far, you have to treat with a pinch of salt, a very big pinch of salt, because a lot of that got discussed and to some extent taken apart later. But as these things go online, of course, people rediscover all of this, and it ends up going on their websites as potential trees and so on. Let's do a quick word on the other one, who's the Edward Swan. He is my longest standing family history problem. Essentially, we've got about 23 people now in this chart. This is the other emigrant who went to Maryland. He had 3 sons. This is just a snapshot chart. There's a lot of descendants from here, a lot of descendants from here, a lot of descendants from here, and this is just a snapshot to show that these are some of the people at the bottom that we've DNA tested to get our markers patterns. So this branch is fairly well characterized. These branches, which I'm probably not going to have time to show you, they are all the people that come in that you can't lick back with a paper tree. And so what I desperately need is people with paper trees back to these people here at the top left, so that we can relate the other ones in. And I guess we're getting a bit short of time, are we now? 3 minutes, okay. So I'm not going to go on much further than that to get to the bits. I'll have to have words with Maurice afterwards and truncate some of the bits that I've got in there. But that's the gist of where I've got to on one of my biggest DNA projects. I've got about 23 people in here in terms of STR markers. And if any of us work on these types of surname projects, it's how do you sort out branch pathways with these markers. So I'll have words with Maurice afterwards. I'll put those slides in with the actual marker patterns that's there, cut out some of the other stuff that I've got in the back, and we'll leave it at that stage. But this is the biggest cluster that I've got, and of course there's loads and loads of people in here that would like to know where this gentleman comes from at the top, who's the gateway ancestor. I do have to say, and I'll add this as one slide when it goes up online, I've listed the swans now that could be this Edward Swan at the top based on information. And the key candidate we have to rule out is an Edward Swan who was baptized in St. Stephen Coleman Street in London in 1632-33. And he took his name from Swan Alley because he was a foundling child. You name foundling children after where they were found in London. So, as I say, everyone has to get their surnames from somewhere, but it's probably not the answer that most people like as to where their family comes from. There are a couple of other candidates down in Kent that we've got to try and tease apart, but you can't actually rule out the person who's there because basically we can't bury him. There are defects, as always, in the London registers, particularly through the Commonwealth period, etc. So it's very difficult to tie these things down. But we all want, the point I'm only making is we all want it to end up somewhere nice. And I had a theory about a year ago and some DNA evidence it could fit into another family called Bean, and there was an association. But in fact, having done all the DNA testing around that with Beans, we conclusively ruled out that they were not connected in any way. I thought I had a wonderful way to identify a non-paternity event, essentially, in London in the mid-1600s. But the DNA ended up falling out completely the wrong way. We had documentary evidence to support that, elements of that, but the DNA ruled that out. So I think I'm going to stop there. Give us a little bit of time if there are any questions to that. But thank you for our romp through shipping, emigration. Sorry, yeah.
Thanks very much, Brian. Fantastic presentation. I think it really gives us an insight into how. Well, I'm amazed you actually have gone back into the 1700s and 1600s, and that as your Swan DNA project is actually helping you decipher a lot of the big, huge family tree of the Swan family. How many people in your Swan DNA project?
Well, that graph I showed there, the membership, that's about 111.
111.
About 111. What I again, other people do it. I run the people with the actual Swan surname on a spreadsheet as a separate exercise, and that's about 65, 70 people that are in there.
And of the people, so about 60 or 70 people have done a Y DNA test?
Yeah.
And how many of them are American? How many of them are British?
Put it the other way, the number of people that are British are in single figures.
Really? Okay, so the vast majority of our project members are American.
Yeah.
Now, how many people have DNA projects here in the audience? Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, quite a few, 5. Okay. I've got several as well, and a lot of people will think that, well, there's no point in having Americans in there because their genealogies just go back to about 1800 or so, and in many cases that's true. Some of them go back further than that, but certainly from the Irish point of view, I find a lot of the American genealogies go back much further than the genealogies in Ireland. So the Americans can actually be very informative for Irish genealogies. And the other thing that I think is very, very useful from my point of view, and you probably find the same in your project as well, is that even though a lot of the American genealogies, all they know is that their ancestors came from Ireland or from England, but they're the ones that will actually buy the expensive tests.
Yes.
So even if they don't have extensive genealogies, they have deeper pockets than most people in Britain and Ireland. So they will actually reach into those pockets and buy the expensive tests. Have you found that as well?
I said this is my biggest tree. It's got about 23 people in it that are potentially related, and we have at least 2 big Y tests in there now. One, surprise, surprise, from this family over here that's characterized, and one from well, the other one we don't actually know. It's one of these 17 that essentially we can't connect on paper. The one comment I'd make in general, I found it really hard work in this case for people to get interested in families that are not their specific line. They will test themselves, be interested in their line. The message that really you'll solve this overall problem by testing other people besides yourself to help sort out the branch patterns in there. I've only got one person on these 2 people here that actually has a pedigree back to these 2 people. There are paper pedigrees that exist there, but it's challenging to get people to take that step to really realize that that's what they need to do to sort out their family history. The whole of this has to hang together to tell a self-consistent story. And that's obviously the message with DNA. Everything has to hang together to tell a self-consistent story.
And of course, you want the people from this line here and the people from this line here to do the big Y test, preferably, so that you can get a genetic signature for those particular 2 lines.
Yes. I've done a lot, certainly since I came back on this project, I've done a lot of work on this. And I have actually got 1 or 2 people now who do actually start to realize that this is important. One guy certainly has helped me, he's got a background in computing, so he's helped me set up a Facebook site. Because I thought, Glode, if I'm going to do all of this and run all of that as well, with other, I've got at least one other surname project that I'm involved in, etc. There's only so much you can do.
And have you had any recruits from the Facebook site?
We are literally just starting on that. We've got about, off the top of my head, 35 or 40 members already, and it's building.
It's a great way of passively recruiting to your project, because when I took on the Farrell project, one of the reasons why I was enthusiastic about it was because there already was a Farrell clan Facebook group. Guess how many people there were in it? 3,000. So I had access to 3,000 potential recruits in the Farrell clan Facebook page. And in actual fact, it worked very well. And I get maybe 1 recruit every 8 weeks or so into my projects just because there is a pre-existing Facebook page dealing with that particular family name. Yeah. So you might find that the Swan Facebook group will actually get you recruits.
Very, very, very quickly, the guy who's helped me do that, there's a building out in, I can't remember the place, but it's in West Virginia called the Swan House, and it's essentially the place, I think, where the people got together to break West Virginia away from Virginia, which my understanding happened in 1863 or thereabouts. I'm winging that, so I get a nice friend from France and people who may know history, but it's round about that. But that was it. There's this Swan House and people associated with it play a fairly key role in West Virginia Foundation history. So he's been quite actively involved in getting it preserved, this sort of thing, you know. So he's quite interested in local history and has a significant range of contacts. Yeah, he's been wanting to help me for some time, but you know, he's had, as always, family issues to sort through, etc.
You take help when you can, where
Absolutely.
you can get it.
Especially, yeah.
Well, we have to end it there, but I just want to say a very special thank you to Brian, because not only has he given us a fabulous lecture on how shipping and emigration is so important to our one-name studies, but if it wasn't for Brian, none of us would actually be here today. Because back in 2009, Brian convinced Family Tree DNA to come to Who Do You Think You Are for the first time, and since then we've had DNA lectures every year. We've had people testing on Family Tree DNA, and none of you would be here today if it wasn't for this man here. So I'd like to ask you to give a warm round of applause for Brian Swann.